Hi, and welcome to the Two Texts podcast. I'm here with my co-host John Andrews, and my name is David Harvey. This is a podcast of two friends from two different countries, meeting every 2 weeks to talk about the Bible. Each week we pick one text to talk about, which invariably leads us to talking about two texts, and often many more. This season we're taking a long, slow journey through the book of Acts to explore how the first Christians encountered the disruptive presence of the Holy Spirit. John, in our last episode, we are in this situation of Paul's shipwreck, or Paul telling them they're going to run aground in Acts 27, from verse 27 through to the end of the chapter. And the boat is careening towards what we know to be Malta, but they don't, at this point in this story, know what on earth is going on. And we talked about some of the happenings that sort of bookend this part of the story. So the sailors attempt to abandon Paul's confidence, the way that people like the centurion are used by God to come alongside Paul, this recurring theme. You made this gorgeous connection as to how there's so many echoes of the Spirit's work here, as in the story of the Philippian jail. And I loved all of that. But we sort of bookended around it in the last episode. But then in the middle of this section, there's a tense moment where the sailors have been prevented from escaping. We've not yet discovered that the soldiers are about to try and kill all the prisoners. And everyone's just in that moment where they're holding on to Paul's words that we're going to be saved. Yeah. And we get this little middle narrative where Paul urges them to eat, tells them to sort of, hang on. And this is where we also discover there's 276 of them on this boat. And they have to eat, essentially fill themselves up, because they're going to turf everything off overboard to hopefully get this boat as light as they can and run it aground. But there's this little scene of Paul talking to them and spending time with them that's got some real gorgeous nuggets in it that we want to just focus on.
Yeah. Absolutely beautiful, and again, it really humanizes the story as well, doesn't it? So you get the drama. I think what Dr. Luke does beautifully is dovetail the sort of big feel of the story. You could almost be watching this in a cinema production, You got these big sweeping ideas, big storm, and the ship being tossed around, and of course the background is Paul's on his way to Rome, so you've got all. But as the story goes on, it's getting more and more humanized. So you're seeing the fear of the sailors; they're trying to get overboard. You're seeing, the actions of the soldiers. You're seeing, as we discussed last time, even the centurion turning a little bit more towards Paul. And I love the sort of humanization of this section, which is absolutely beautiful, and the sense in which thinking about their own needs, where he draws it out. He says, "You've been in constant suspense and have gone without food, and you haven't eaten anything." I love that. So I love this recognition from Paul that he understands and senses and feels what these people are going through. And you get this lovely, almost, can I say, pastoral moment. It's a gorgeous, it's almost a calm in the storm moment. Now, how bad the storm is at this stage, or whether they're just disoriented, they're being driven along, sort of thing. But it seems to be in the middle of the disorientation, in the middle of the darkness, in the middle of the madness, Paul brings a calm, beautiful, pastoral moment, and it really does feel like tender. You even as you're reading it in the text, you sort of calm down reading it, because you're being carried along by this. So I love the pastoral feel of this in the midst of, like last time we had a slightly missional conversation that Paul's concerned about the salvation and well-being, as it were, of these people. But here we have a very tender pastoral moment. You've all been wound up. You're all like really, really suspense filled and drama and anxious. Now everyone needs to calm down. You need to have some food. So I love this sort of intimacy and humanization of this moment.
I was thinking as well, just to expand on our conversation in the last episode about the work of the Spirit. I can't hold all of this in my head right now, but it just came to me as you were talking just there, that how often the work of the Spirit in the Old Testament is just really, really practical. So I'm thinking of Elijah, right? He's like sat down and the Lord brings food to him. I'm thinking about the people of Israel before they crossed the Red Sea. Like, we call this the great feast of Passover now.
Yeah.
But there was deep practicalities to it. Hey, we're going on a long trip. we should definitely eat before we go. And
indeed.
And I think about how there's something beautiful about, and we're going to see it just a minute. Not even the hair on your head will be lost. The intimacy of the Spirit in the way that even basic human things like we need to eat is not lost to God. And I don't think that's the point of this part of the story, but I think it's a beautiful awareness that these things matter to God.
Yeah. And I think, like, when I read a story like this, I think, why did Luke include that? Luke could have just said, yeah, it was a really bad storm. Paul gave us a word. We eventually run aground, and it all worked out like exactly how Paul said. I mean, Luke could have told us this story in a third of the words. So why do we have this detail? Like, and why does Luke include this moment where you've got this almost this little gathering, and Paul's urging them to eat that because they need to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. My goodness, what a beautiful echo. And then we get this gorgeous, now, I mean, for us as followers of Jesus, my goodness, you're seeing something here that we could be overcooking. But verse 35, after he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. Now, again, we don't want to overcook. We don't want to overcook that, but neither do we want to ignore this. There's something almost kind of say Eucharistic about this. There's almost something like, my goodness, is this food, or is this worship? Is this Paul centering something? Is Paul speaking the traditional Jewish blessing over this? Is Paul saying something where he's invoking the name of the Lord here? He's taking this as a moment, and clearly he has got their attention because he does it in front of them. And then it says, verse 36, they were all encouraged and ate some food for themselves. Now look at the order. The encouragement comes pre-eating. So we might want to suggest that the encouragement is coming because of the way Paul has positioned this conversation. And dare we even said the way Paul has broken bread with them, that actually having said these things, having broken the bread before them, they're now encouraged to eat.
Yes.
Now, I mean, you think if people are hungry, they don't need to be encouraged to eat. So something's happened there. I think the language is strong. They've not just oh yeah we need to eat something because that's like biology, right? No, they've been encouraged, and then they eat. And yes. I think that detail is beautiful from Luke. I think he's saying more than, hey, everyone just pause for a moment and had some food. I think he's saying something went on here, and Paul is doing something here with food, and the people on the ship or the boat are being encouraged because of Paul's words, not just strengthened because of the food.
Yes. I mean, I thoroughly agree. I think there's so much going on in this that we need to pay attention, to texts like this. I mean, if you look, I can't help but want to have some some fun with this, John. But like, if you take this text here and overlay it on your favorite texts, and I'm curious. I know that you know what I mean when I say your favorite text, but I'm wondering if listeners have hung with us long enough now. But if you take Acts 27:35 and overlay it with Luke 24 verse 30, notice exactly the same things happen.
Indeed.
Right? So Jesus gets to Emmaus in Luke 24 verse 30. He comes to table with them. He takes bread, gives thanks, and breaks it. Right?
Yep.
And notice Paul, after he says this, he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it. Right? And the only difference, of course, I mean, and it's significant, the difference in Luke 24 is that Jesus then is taken from them.
Yes.
Right? But I'm convinced, and listeners have heard me talk about this before, but I'm convinced that the center of Christian worship in Acts is the Eucharist, right?
Yeah.
And this sequence of taking, thanking, and breaking, you see it in multiple places in Acts. And you see it elsewhere in the New Testament as well, to the extent that I think these words are intentionally triggering. Right?
Yes.
So I don't think you're stretching it to say that this is a Eucharist meal on this shipwrecked boat, on this boat about to be shipwrecked, because I think Luke has spent too much time elsewhere using that sequence of words. I mean, listen, let me say it clearly like this. If you've got to verse 27 of chapter 27 with us on two texts, every listener knows that we think Luke's words are carefully chosen.
Absolutely.
He's not just randomly throwing out words. So to take a sequence of words that he has used, not just in Acts, but in the Emmaus story, the idea that Luke could talk with the precision of language that we've seen him use elsewhere, and then accidentally throw in took, thanked, and broke. I mean, I think I'll fight you in the street that that's not an accident, right? That Luke intends us to see something profound is happening. Now, there's multiple profound things. As somebody who believes deeply in an open table, right? So I one of the things I practice in my own church is that we don't hold denominational boundaries. The table is a place where everyone is welcome to come and meet Jesus. It strikes me that at this point, right, now think about this. So we've all experienced that process of, well, maybe we've not. Hopefully we've not all experienced it. You go to a church and it's like, oh, communion's only for members, or communion's only for this particular type of person. And I'm always struck that I think biblically communion's for anyone that wants to confess Jesus as Lord. Yeah. Now, notice Luke's sequence here, right? He took bread, he gave thanks, and he broke it. This is the point where Luke decides to tell us, oh, by the way, there's 276 people on board.
Indeed.
Right? This is the point where he decides to want to make a point that everybody was there. Right?
Yes.
Now, this is very subtle, but I think it's really significantly subtle. That why does Luke think this is the moment that he wants to tell us that everyone's there? And I think it's because Christ is for everyone, right?
Yes.
I think, or at least I think we can take that inference from this, that Luke doesn't want us to think at this point, oh, this is just Paul and his buddies now, right?
Yeah.
This is everyone. Like, is potentially the centurion taking communion, right? Are these scumbag sailors that were about to leap over the side of the boat a few moments ago, are they invited to the table to confess Jesus as Lord? Because notice what's very clear. And this, to me, by the way, this is, if anyone's a pastor listening, this is how you can have an open table. Because he took bread, he gave thanks to God in front of them all. Right?
Absolutely.
So the reason that we often have to have a table that's closed is because we lead our moments of the table in such obtuse ways that if you weren't really sure what's going on, you're still not really sure what's going on. But a good communion service makes, in no uncertain terms, everybody knows, oh, we're here to confess the resurrection of Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus, and his lordship. Yep. So nobody's coming to the table going, I think they're just having a snack in the middle of this service. Yep. We're like, oh, we're doing something here. So the taking, the giving thanks to God in front of them all, right? I mean, Luke's language is stunning here. That's it. He wants you to make sure nobody is uncertain as to what's happening here.
Yeah.
So forgive my ranting, John. I don't think that you're overplaying this at all. I think this is a stunning moment Can I say it like this? I would be tempted to even say that this is a moment of salvation inside a moment of salvation, right?
Yeah.
So we have the salvation of the souls from the shipwreck, but in classic Acts form. But what about something deeper than this?
Yes.
That this group of people have gathered around the table of the Lord, in which we proclaim him, as died, resurrected, and coming again for us. I mean, I don't think we're stretching that too far. I mean, you're welcome to part company with me for sure, but I think Luke's telling us something gorgeous that's going on here.
Oh no, I totally agree. I'm totally comfortable with that. And I think, of course, if you also track the language of Emmaus is also an almost identical echo to the language of Luke at the Last Supper.
Yes.
So you've got a triple whammy going on there. And then, of course, if you track it back even further, when he breaks the bread and blesses the bread before the feeding of the 5,000 in Luke,
same language.
there are echoes again. So you get a gorgeous missional feel in the feeding of the 5,000. You get this beautiful Last Supper. And of course, there are people included at that Last Supper who have certain agendas that are going to be exposed. And then you've got the Emmaus Road, and then you've got here. And I do think at the very least, we are meant to see the connection.
Yes.
I think at the very least. How hard people want to drive that connection or how nervous people are about it. But I do love, I'm with you on this. I love the idea that the most dynamic expression of God's mercy and grace to the world is actually in the broken bread and the given cup. It is in a weird way and glorious way, it's the one table that should be the most open. And yet, certainly, and I don't want to criticize my upbringing because I had a wonderful upbringing, but certainly in the church I grew up in, it was one of the most closed. So it was an almost, members only dynamic. And yet, ironically, it's the table that's saying to every broken, lost sailor and soldier on a boat in the dark, it's saying there is hope. There is hope that actually you can come and receive something glorious. And I love the topping and tailing, David, around it. So I love the idea of verse 34. Take some of this for your health, for your saving, for your survival. Verse 34, and not a hair from your head will be lost. Again, I think an allusion to the words of Jesus there. And you get this little saving, health, survival nuance in verse 34. And then verse 36 after, you've got they were encouraged and then they ate. And so you're getting a sort of a survival conversation before they ate. You've got an encouragement after they ate, and right in the middle, gluing those two eyes together, you've got this blessing the bread, breaking the bread, and taking the bread. Again, wherever you go with it, it should not be ignored. I think there is a gorgeous, intimate, Eucharistic echo in the context of this dynamic, turbulent, disorientating, dark, miserable moment. That something of hope enters in, to the extent that every one of the 276, and literally in the text, souls, every one of them are encouraged. And you go, wow, okay, whatever that means, that's a pretty dynamic moment.
I mean, think about like a legitimate translation of verse 34 is, now I urge you, take some food. You need it for your salvation. For your salvation,
yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that's not like, I would say this to listeners, that's not John and I being playful with the Greek. The word that's used there is soteria.
Yeah.
It's the word that everywhere else we translate it as salvation. So It's stunning that Paul says, take some food, you need it for salvation. And then he doesn't then just go, here's some food, right?
Yeah.
He takes it, gives thanks to God, breaks it. I mean, if you think about there's multiple ways to think about this. If we had listeners that were coming from a Roman Catholic tradition, they would happily sit with this notion of the connection of Eucharist and salvation. Maybe if you're coming from a free church tradition, think about it in this particular way. What do we do when we gather around the Eucharist table? We proclaim the Lord's death and resurrection until he comes. Which all of us is, that's the core of our salvation. So whatever way, like I always want to live in a deeply ecumenical space to go, the history of the church tells us we can all find different ways to come to these things. I don't think the important thing is how you think this is working out at the Eucharist table, but rather more that what is biblically found is that the table is the place where we confess that Christ is our Savior, right? And there's no tradition of the church that I know that doesn't confess that at the table, right? You know, from the most independent and free to the most orthodox, all of us are coming and saying this is where, because of exactly what you've seen happen. We see Jesus do this so many times we can't ignore it. But there's even that stunning level of, here we have people that are hungry. The feeding of the 5,000 was about people who were hungry.
Absolutely.
And what does Jesus do to hungry people? He takes bread, gives thanks to God, breaks it, and shares it. So going back to what we said in the previous episode, this is the Spirit working in Paul, doing the sort of things that Jesus does. It's exactly what we should. This is the predictability of the Spirit, that we may not know exactly how the Spirit works, but the Spirit will always sound like Jesus.
Yes, beautiful.
And it's so good, isn't it?
It is so good. It is so good. And I think I would encourage, as we are encouraging our listeners, that to read this not simply as a simple informational moment. Oh yeah, they had some food before, you know, the shipwreck thing happened. To lift it above that basic level, that even if it's only just about food, Paul positions the food at a ministry level. He's positioning this food not just as food to their heart, to their bodies, but food to their souls.
Yes,
and I think that's where then you have this sense of more is going on here than simply, hey guys, you need to eat something. But there's a sense in which Paul is ministering through this food, through this breaking of bread, through this Eucharistic moment. And I think I know we've labored it in the sense that hopefully in a positive way and make people go away and have a wee think about it, because I would suspect many, many people have never even seen this illusion before. And if they have, like, they've noticed this, it's just a piece of information about eating, isn't it? But look at all the connectors. Look at how what goes before, what goes after, the way the 276 are mentioned, and the nuances within that are absolutely, I think, fascinating and dynamic, missional, soteriological. And certainly something that feels like it's been led by the power of the Spirit into a chaotic, dark, disorientated moment, which is exactly the story of the gospel.
Yes.
The light shines into the chaos of the darkness and brings order, hope, and encouragement.
If you let me be, maybe we've over-labored this, but I don't think this is repetitive, what I'm about to say. But if you'll let me be a bit creative, so this is Paul, and Luke is reporting on Paul. So we're seeing the work of the Spirit in Paul's life. If our listeners would indulge me, if you then go to Colossians, right? Take Colossians chapter 3. And I mean, I'm just having a little fun here, but I think this is why people pay their money for two texts. Colossians chapter 3, you might want to jump there, John, yourself, and start at verse 9, right?
Yep.
So verse 9 of Colossians chapter 3, do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self for these practices. Put on a new self, being renewed in the knowledge of the image of its creator, right? So, and I'm being super playful here, but bear in mind, this is the same Paul that we're reading about.
Yep.
Don't go over the side of a boat pretending that you're about to drop an anchor and actually you're planning to run away, okay? I mean, I'm just being playful with that one, but it gets more serious. The next verse in Colossians, the very next verse, Here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised, uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all in all. So we have soldiers, we have sailors, and we have 270 people who are almost, right? So this, I'm not saying that Paul's talking about this in Colossians. I'm talking about the constant work of the Spirit in Paul's life. We're seeing his worldview here, right?
Yeah.
Therefore, as God's chosen, holy, and dearly loved people, clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other. Forgive one another if you have a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. I think we're seeing that in Paul in this passage here, right?
Yeah.
And then this is the bit where, I realized I wanted to mention that stuff because it's just beautiful how we see it in Paul. Colossians 3:15, let a peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you were called to peace. And be, in the Greek word is Eucharist, and be thankful, right? So be Eucharistic people, right, at some level. And then he says, now think about what you've done layering in the, we talked about the Philippians echoes in the Philippian jailer. Let the message of Christ, let the word of Christ is literally the Greek here. Let the word of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom, through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your heart, right? With gracefulness in our heart, right? I mean, this is gorgeous what we're seeing from Paul here, and this is just good reading. But then he says this, and this is where I think it gets really fascinating. And whatever you do, and the word he uses here is poieo, right? Which is this word where I've mentioned this before on two texts. This is the word where we as English people get poetry from. It means to create, to make. Now, what's interesting, and I'm being playful again here, is that's what Jesus tells the disciples at the Eucharist table. He tells them, do this, make this, he says. Make this in remembrance of me. Paul says, whatever you make, whatever you create, whatever you do, whether in word or in deed, do it in the name of the Lord. And now we get giving thanks to God, right? So now we get this Eucharist language comes again. So at the first Eucharist, Jesus says, we're Eucharisting to God. You guys do this, right?
Yeah.
And everybody should know by now, listen to me, I want to take Eucharist really seriously as a moment of the church. But I think Jesus is also painting them of a vision of what happens beyond the table, right? That you do this, you proclaim the Lord's death and resurrection until he comes at this table, and then you go out and be a Eucharist people for the world.
Yeah,
and it's fascinating that here in Colossians 3:17, Paul now says, whatever you do, whether word or deed, Eucharistic, right? So there's a level where now.
Beautiful.
I'm forming these ideas still in my own sort of reflections and study. But it fascinates me that Paul's come to them and he said, don't lie, have peace, put on all the virtues of God. Everybody, Jew or Greek, slave or free is welcome. But then the core call to these Colossians is do. Yeah. When we hear do this, be a Eucharist people in word or in deed. And what's gorgeous is here now Luke's saying, that's what Paul is like. Like he's on this shipwrecking boat. And what does he do? I would say, and it feels like you agree with me, he does a Eucharist, but he does a Eucharist that's not just a moment of a service. It's a Eucharist that leaks out that into who they are for these people. And as Paul says, for our salvation. And I mean, I hope that makes sense as to why I brought that Colossians 3 moment in there just now. But I think we're seeing a deep insight into the missional heart of Paul, which begins at the table and sort of leaks out into the world from him.
Love it. I mean, I love that. I've never seen the connection to Colossians there. Absolutely beautiful. I mean, I love your language. I love the language of living Eucharistically. I mean, I don't know if it's a real word or we've just made stuff up, but I love that. I love the idea of living out of and with and through. You know, somehow we've understood that this table is open. This table is a phenomenal expression of the generosity, the grace, the goodness, the loving kindness of the Lord, and that we we are able to participate in it for no other reason that he came into our world and saved us and invites us to participate. The spirit of that Eucharistic idea, the spirit of that, what we have received from him in grace, to live that a life of thankfulness, to live a life of gratitude, to live a life of generosity to our world, which in effect is, what Paul is doing again on this boat is just remarkable. And he's doing it to a community, some of whom have no view on him up to this point. He's just another prisoner being transported. He's doing it before people who actually have a disdain for him. They'd be very happy to pull out their sword and stick it into Paul before the ship goes down. And yet he's somehow bringing something of the glory of that table to the antithesis of how most of us will celebrate the table. We celebrate the table in order, in light, surrounded by either artificial lights or candles. We celebrate with friends. We celebrate with family. We celebrate in a very beautiful worship-orientated setting. This is the antithesis of the table. This is the antithesis of how most of us experience it. And yet, could it be argued that missionally, this is exactly what it was always intended for, that it was meant to be lived out, it was meant to be displayed in the rough, the tumble, the chaos, the mess, the disorientation, the darkness, all the stuff that we see happening on that ship. I mean, what state that ship must have been in by the end of that journey before it's even shipwrecked, goodness only knows. So you would have all sorts of stuff swilling around that ship, and men who would be smelling not very good, and lives and bad language and recklessness and fear. It's all kicking off, and in the midst of it, Paul breaks bread, gives thanks, and takes it, and you go, my goodness, it's a moment of absolute pure, can I say, grace and love in the midst of horror. And maybe that's what it was always intended to be. Maybe that's what it was originally. And maybe that's what we should seek to recover, to live Eucharistically as the one who gave himself for us lived.
So that's it for this episode. We know that there's always more to explore, and we encourage you to dive into the text and do that. If you liked this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you rated, reviewed, or shared it. We also appreciate all of our listeners who financially support the show, sharing the weight of producing this podcast. If you'd like to support the show, visit twotexts.com. But that is all for now, so until next time, from John and I, goodbye.